Imagine a room where decisions that shift fortunes are made in the space between headlines and balance sheets. A room with auction gavel echoes, emergency memos, and phone lines that never quite go silent. That, as the terrain we were exploring, how state actions, taking assets into public hands or selling them into private pockets, can become the most efficient engines of wealth creation for a tiny class of players who already have access capital and timing. At first glance, the story is tidy. Privatize an inefficient state firm, let markets discipline management, boost productivity, and the country gains. That is often true. Many international evaluations show productivity and welfare gains from well-designed privatizations, but the reality is built out of caveats. Who runs the auction, how transparent the bids are, what regulatory guardrails exist, and whether the proceeds are used transparently for public benefit or diverted to shore up budgets or political campaigns. Those details determine whether privatization becomes a national win or a transfer of sovereign value into private vaults. The ultra-rich win when three things align. First, access to privileged information or decision-makers. Second, the ability to mobilize large amounts of capital quickly. And third, moments of stress. Financial crises, political transitions, or compressed timelines, when governments prefer speed over scrutiny. In such windows, assets are sometimes sold in fire sale style or through negotiated deals that favor a pre-selected bidder. Look at transitional Russia in the 1990s. The so-called loans for shares arrangements funneled huge state stakes in energy and metal firms into the hands of a handful of bankers and managers who could outbid everyone else, not only because they had capital, but because they had political channels that opened auctions at bargain prices. That rapid concentration of formerly public wealth into private hands is textbook how fortunes are made in one political cycle. The lesson for a close observer: information and timing matter more than skillful operational turnarounds when the rules of the game are uneven. If this angle is already sparking ideas, hit subscribe to Investor School. Quick, focused deep dives like this land here every week. Sometimes the playbook flips, but the beneficiaries don't change. Governments nationalize in a crisis to stop systemic collapse, take emergency ownership of banks or strategic firms, pour in liquidity, and stabilize confidence. That public ownership is rarely meant to be permanent. The state often intends to clean the balance sheet and sell the asset back to private hands when the smoke clears. That two-step sequence, nationalize, stabilize, reprivatize, creates a new opportunity set for well-connected buyers who can obtain preferred access to the post-crisis sales or who can shape the rules governing the sale. The UK's experience in 2007-2009 illustrates this rhythm. Northern Rock and the Royal Bank of Scotland moved from private failure to state ownership during the global financial crisis, and the subsequent restructuring and disposal processes raised intense debates over who gained, who lost, and how much taxpayers ultimately paid or recovered. When you analyze these episodes, you see the same structural pattern: emergency public intervention, followed by controlled exits that often disproportionately reward buyers with political or financial pull. That pattern is a practical route by which large fortunes can be preserved or multiplied across a crisis cycle. For an investor paying attention, and for any regulator who wants markets that are fair, the implications are simple and seismic. First, markets where privatization or reprivatization decisions are likely must be evaluated not only for asset quality and cash flows, but for governance transparency, auction design, and political risk. Those structural variables move prices more than quarterly earnings when assets change hands under special procedures. Second, the ultra-wealthy extract value not just by operating assets better, but by being the counterparty who buys during windows of opacity. That's why concentration, insider networks, and political influence are core parts of the story. Third, international institutions and policy conditionalities have historically nudged countries toward privatization as a fiscal tool, which can accelerate reforms and efficiency in well-run cases, but has also been associated with shifts in income distribution where safeguards were weak. The practical takeaway: if you're investing in markets undergoing privatization or recent nationalization, build models that price and governance transparency, potential preferential deal terms, and the political economics of who gets to bid. Those risk-adjusted returns are where the real alpha and the real moral questions live. In later parts, we'll unpack concrete due diligence checklists and real-world case studies so you can see the signals the ultra-rich look for, and the defenses that can protect everyday investors and public interest alike. When you strip away the complexity and focus on the core dynamics, you start to see that the game of privatizations and nationalizations is less about ideology and more about power. For the ultra-rich, the opportunity lies in the misalignment between urgency and value. Governments need to act quickly, often under political or economic pressure, while large investors can afford patience and precision. This creates asymmetry, where distressed assets or sudden shifts in ownership rules can be converted into long-term advantages. It is not necessarily about being the smartest in the room, but about being positioned where the decisions happen first, with enough liquidity and influence to strike while the rest of the market is still processing the news. That is why, time and again, fortunes are multiplied in the shadows of these transitions, while the broader public perceives only the surface narrative of reform or rescue. The pattern is global and timeless. From Latin America to Eastern Europe, from Asia to Western financial hubs, waves of privatization or nationalization have created predictable cycles: a government under strain, a wave of asset transfers, a consolidation of ownership among those who can play the high-stakes game. For ordinary investors, the temptation is to assume that this arena is untouchable, reserved only for billionaires and sovereign funds. But that is not entirely true. By studying the mechanics of these deals, identifying the sectors likely to be affected, and watching for early policy signals, smaller investors can position themselves around the edges of these massive shifts. Supply chains, secondary markets, and even bond markets tied to these assets often reprice long before the headlines catch up, creating opportunities for those who are alert and disciplined. The deeper lesson, however, is not just about chasing profits. It is about understanding the ecosystem you are part of. When wealth is concentrated through waves of privatizations or post-crisis reprivatizations, the playing field tilts. Regulations, labor markets, and even consumer prices shift to reflect new ownership structures. If you are blind to this, you are playing on a board where someone else sets the rules. If you are aware of it, you can anticipate moves, protect your portfolio from sudden shocks, and even identify moments when ethical considerations matter as much as financial returns. The ultra-rich do not simply exploit opportunities. They shape them by lobbying, negotiating, and leveraging influence. Recognizing this helps you see markets not as neutral arenas, but as landscapes constantly redrawn by power. And this is where your journey as an investor becomes more than just financial. You are not simply watching charts or reading balance sheets. You are learning to decode the language of power, timing, and access. Every privatization, every nationalization, every rescue deal carries within it a map of who wins and who loses, and why. The ultra-rich have built empires by mastering this map, but that does not mean you must remain outside its borders. By paying attention, by asking the deeper questions, and by refusing to accept the surface story at face value, you equip yourself with a lens that few possess. And with that lens, you are no longer just following markets. You are interpreting them, predicting them, and positioning yourself for opportunities that others will never even see. That is the edge you can carry forward, one grounded not in chance, but in understanding.